Alors, bonsoir à toutes et à tous. Je me présente, je suis France-Isabelle Langlois, je suis la directrice générale d'Amnesty International Canada francophone. Alors, désolée pour les quelques minutes de retard que nous avons, on avait quelques soucis techniques. Alors, justement, commençons par ça. Vous avez la traduction simultanée d'offerte. Et il vous faut cliquer sur le globe terrestre qui apparaît au bas de l'écran et vous devez choisir le canal de la langue de votre choix, le français ou l'anglais. Les principales panélistes vont parler en anglais. L'animation qui est assurée par moi se fera en français. Et il y a également Madame Viviane Michel qui parlera en français. Vous pourrez poser vos questions dans l'une ou l'autre des langues. Donc voilà, alors bonjour et bienvenue à cet événement virtuel sur le thème de la loi sur les Indiens et le militantisme des femmes autochtones organisé en collaboration donc avec Femmes autochtones du Québec et le soutien de l'Alliance féministe pour l'action internationale. Autre petit détail technique que je vous indique, votre micro est désactivé pour une meilleure audibilité des intervenantes plutôt. Et puis, il y aura une période de questions à la suite des interventions. Donc, avant tout, je voulais reconnaître que je suis située en territoire autochtone non cédé où la nation Kanien'kehá:ka Mohawk est reconnue comme gardienne des terres et des eaux. L'île appelée Montréal est connue comme Tujake dans la langue des Kanien'kehá:ka et elle a été historiquement un point de rencontre pour d'autres peuples autochtones, y compris les Wendat, Abénaquis et Anishinabeg. Je vais commencer par céder la parole à Madame Viviane Michel, donc, qui est présidente de Femmes autochtones du Québec et à l'initiative de qui nous sommes réunis ici ce soir. Donc, Madame Michel, elle est présidente de FAC depuis 2012. Elle a été élue par les représentantes des 10 nations membres de FAC et du milieu urbain. Elle représente l'organisme à titre de porte-parole et défend les intérêts des femmes autochtones auprès des différents paliers gouvernementaux. Elle met un point d'honneur à valoriser les pratiques traditionnelles et à promouvoir le respect de l'identité et de la culture des nations et des femmes autochtones. Alors, sans plus tarder, Viviane, je te cède la parole.
Oui, تنشكمدن فرانس إيزابيل تبغوا قاعدة نونو تمد هيك نشكمو قاعدة بندك مامون تاك تجي دتو مينات تباج مشتادات دتو مينات تجي بيك بدتات تجي non. Bonjour tout le monde. Je me permets toujours de remercier les créateurs, évidemment, de nous donner cette belle opportunité, justement. Et ça, cette activité de ce soir fait partie aussi du plan d'action qu'on est en train de construire sur le racisme et la discrimination systémique envers les femmes autochtones. Je pense qu'on va de bon train, évidemment. Je tiens aussi, avant que je l'oublie, à remercier ces guerrières qui sont présentes avec nous ce soir. Ce sont des guerrières et j'ai hâte de les entendre. Je les appelle les guerrières parce qu'ils ont eu l'audace d'aller vers les instruments internationaux, comme on pourrait dire, aller défendre le droit des femmes. Je me sens très petite à côté d'elles. Voilà. Vous savez, à Femmes autochtones du Québec, on travaille beaucoup la lutte des femmes, évidemment, mais aussi le racisme, la discrimination envers les femmes. On est une organisation qui existe depuis 47 ans, quand même, 47 ans à faire de la défense des droits des femmes, à faire la lutte des femmes, à créer des outils pour nos femmes ici au Québec. On représente les 10 nations au Québec, incluant le milieu urbain. Donc, nous répondons aux besoins des femmes, mais ce n'est pas l'organisation qui va décider pour les femmes, c'est les femmes qui nous donnent les mandats. Je pense que c'est vraiment important de l'introduire de cette façon. Mais je vous invite à aller voir notre site web Femmes autochtones du Québec, où est-ce que vous allez voir tout le travail que l'on fait quotidien, avec une belle petite équipe quand même. Donc, évidemment, tout est en lien. Nous travaillons quand même en partenariat avec Amnesty International francophone à passer à l'action dû au récent événement, dont la mort de Joyce Echaquan, évidemment, qui révèle toutes les formes de discrimination vécues par les femmes autochtones. On parle de discrimination systémique, de racisme systémique, parce qu'elles sont, évidemment, parce qu'on est des femmes et parce qu'on est autochtone, on parle de double discrimination. Et comme on a pu le voir avec ce que le gouvernement du Québec est encore dans le déni, à dire que le racisme systémique est existant au Québec, Femmes autochtones du Québec n'a pas peur des mots. Donc, on dit et on le croit qu'il y a le racisme et la discrimination systémique au Québec. Et je pense qu'on va être assez tenante sur ce point-là parce que notre plan d'action vous le dit assez bien. Évidemment, Femmes autochtones fait beaucoup de la défense des droits humains aussi. Donc, 47 ans d'existence, 47 ans de lutte, 47 ans de revendication, de dénonciation, d'action, etc. Je pense que c'est une belle organisation. Si Femmes autochtones du Québec est née aujourd'hui, c'est bien parce que des femmes telles que Mary Touax, telles que Jeannette Lavelle-Cormière, telles que Sharon McCarver, où est-ce qu'elles ont dénoncé que la discrimination était basée sur le genre. Donc, je pense que ça fait la naissance des groupes de femmes pour la défense de droits, donc Femmes autochtones du Québec, évidemment. C'est important aussi d'amener les activités en lien avec le racisme systémique. Femmes autochtones du Québec est beaucoup dans la lutte contre la discrimination basée sur le genre dans la loi sur les Indiens. On sait ce que la loi sur les Indiens a pu faire envers nous, les femmes autochtones. Juste un exemple que je vous donne et qu'on continue encore à dénoncer auprès du ministère des Affaires indiennes, c'est l'imposition de reconnaissance de paternité. Okay? On nous impose la reconnaissance de paternité parce que s'il n'y a pas de reconnaissance de paternité, nos enfants sont encore catégorisés. On a les 6.1, ce qui veut dire 6.1, l'enfant est né de 2 parents autochtones, 6.2, un parent autochtone et un parent non autochtone. Ça a des impacts sur l'identité ou la prochaine génération. Donc, on dénonce justement cette forme d'imposition parce que ça a beaucoup d'impact. On appelle ça des stratégies d'assimilation. Et on est visé, nous les femmes, parce que nous, les femmes autochtones, dans notre responsabilité, on a cette responsabilité de transmettre la langue et la culture à nos enfants. Donc, les stratégies politiques, on le voit de loin et on le dénonce encore aujourd'hui. Ça fait quand même 2 ans que l'on travaille avec ces guerrières que vous allez entendre tout à l'heure. 2 ans de dur labeur à essayer d'avoir des ententes suite à la loi S3. Okay, la loi C3, et je crois qu'elles vont l'aborder ce soir. Je ne veux pas voler leur présentation, mais en même temps, on s'est ralliés, nous, parce que ça rejoint justement toutes les inégalités, la discrimination que nos femmes vivent, et on lutte ensemble. Je pense que plus on peut lutter ensemble, mieux c'est encore, et nos voix sont encore de plus en plus fortes. Donc, voilà, en gros. Pour terminer, parce qu'on m'a dit que le timing est très, déjà qu'on était en retard et on s'en excuse, Femmes autochtones du Québec est en train de travailler un plan d'action. Okay? Et ce plan d'action, c'est vraiment pour autonomiser les femmes dans ce qu'on a pu être témoin quand Joyce Echaquan a fait sa vidéo. Maintenant, ce qu'on veut donner aux femmes, c'est de les outiller au maximum que l'on peut. Ce qui veut dire à connaître leurs droits. On parle des droits humains, on parle des droits internationaux, on parle des droits de la personne. Donc, et je ne souhaite pas que ça se reproduise encore, mais si quelqu'un, toute femme qui peut revivre un moment comme Joyce a vécu, je pense que maintenant, on se donne le droit de dénoncer et le droit de porter plainte. Donc, nous travaillons un guide d'outils pour aider les femmes à lutter contre le racisme systémique et notre période de consultation, elle a déjà été faite avec nos membres. Maintenant, les balises sont construites et il nous reste vraiment à élaborer encore plus. Vous allez être quand même au courant parce que tous les instruments que l'on fait à Femmes autochtones du Québec sont toujours affichés dans notre site web. Évidemment, on a eu aussi le mandat par nos membres d'adopter le principe de Joyce. Je pense que le principe de Joyce demande à ce que toute personne, toute femme autochtone ou être humain d'être reçue avec dignité. Je pense qu'on s'en va sur ce chemin et Femmes autochtones du Québec s'engage justement à être proactive dans le principe de Joyce tout en respectant justement la nation Atikamekw. Donc, je vous remercie. C'était un bref aperçu et j'ai très hâte d'entendre nos panélistes. C'est que maintenant, merci.
Merci, merci Viviane. Alors maintenant, je vous présente notre première panéliste. Il s'agit de Jeannette Corbière-Lavelle, qui, depuis plus de 50 ans, défend des causes qui ont résonné partout au Canada et ailleurs. Elle est membre fondatrice et ancienne présidente de l'Association des femmes autochtones de l'Ontario. Elle a perdu son statut d'autochtone en vertu de l'article 12 de la loi sur les Indiens lorsqu'elle a épousé son mari, non autochtone, en 1970. Elle a contesté cette décision en 1973 devant la Cour suprême du Canada sous le prétexte qu'il établissait une discrimination fondée sur le sexe. Bien qu'elle ait échoué en cours, cet article de loi a finalement été annulé en 1985. Jeannette a plaidé pour les droits des femmes autochtones à l'Organisation des États américains, au Comité des droits de l'homme et au Comité pour mettre fin à la discrimination sexuelle des Nations unies et à la Commission interaméricaine des droits de l'homme. Sa passion pour l'éducation l'a amenée à travailler comme enseignante, directrice d'école et conseillère en éducation, et elle a siégé à de nombreux conseils et comités. Madame Corbière-Lavelle, à vous la parole.
Miigwech. Miigwech endam kinuwayag ki bibzindabueg. Ki wedna nang dishnikas Nishnave Kwendal. Mino wikwam kong unceded territory in Donjaba. I'm just sharing my Nishnave name, which is Giwednang, which in Nishnave is North Star. And I'm from the Wikwemikong unceded territory on Manitoulin Island, Northern Ontario, Georgian Bay specifically. And as I look out the door here, it is spring. It was such a beautiful day. I hope you're all experiencing the same. What I would like to do today is just share, I guess, my experiences. And I believe Vivienne mentioned that it's 49 years for the Quebec Native women. For me, this all started 50 years ago. It started in 1970 when I wouldn't say it's unfortunate because that's the year that I was married to David, and we have 3 beautiful children, many grandchildren. So, but the part that has been challenging and what has been pushing me to work towards the equality and to get rid of the gender-based discrimination in those laws that affect us as Anishinaabe people, specifically Anishinaabe women. Because prior to that, I had prior to my marriage, I had full status within my community, and all my relatives are there. I was born there. I have the language, and this is where I belong. I can't think of any other place that would accept me, number one, but where I would feel comfortable. As Anishinaabe women, we are connected to the land, and very specifically, we have our roles as women within our community, within our clans, and within our teachings, that if at all possible, that we must adhere to them and follow them. So all this I wasn't thinking about in 1970 when David and I were married. But it wasn't too long after that I realized, and it was brought up to me, that I got this letter in the mail that said, Jeanette Corbier, you are no longer a member of Wikwemekong Unceded Reserve. And that was a shock. And I'm sure all of you would know how that feels if you're told that all of a sudden you're not part, you don't belong anymore to your family or to your community, or to the place that you've always called home, where your ancestors are. I can go back many generations to my community and go up in graveyard. I see my great-grandparents, their graves are there on both sides, my mother and my dad's side. And this is the only place to me that was home. So realizing that, David and I spoke, and I said, this is not acceptable. I did realize that many other of my cousins had been through the same thing, and I don't know if they ever really attempted to change the Indian Act. Now we're talking about this piece of legislation that is still here. It's called the Indian Act. But the particular section that affected me at the time, Section 12(1)(b), has been removed, thank goodness. But, and this is what my friends, Sharon and Pamela will be talking about, that it is changing gradually. But can you believe it's taken 50 years to reach this point, and we still haven't been able to get rid of all the discrimination, the gender bias, the racism, really, because these particular sections are trying to do is get rid of us as people. But we are stubborn. And I used to hear people say, Anishinaabe women, number one, they're stubborn. Number two, they will never forget. So I guess this is how it applies to us. And so going back, for those of you, some of you I know have heard my personal story and why it took so long. But for those who haven't, just to share with you, in 1970, after I received that notice, went to my friend at the time, well, he still is my friend, Clayton Ruby, who was a lawyer, young lawyer, and said to him, what can we do about this? And he said, well, you have one day if you want to do something. So one day he appealed it, and that set this whole case rolling that ended up being the Laval case at the Supreme Court. We lost at the county court. Very racist, obviously. This is where it really disturbed me that our justice system could be so discriminatory and racist, because the judge at the county court said, well, we know what Indian women are like. We know what Indian reserves are like. And you should be glad that a white man married you. And this is in our halls of justice, our courts of justice, I should say. At the next level, the Federal Court of Appeal, we won 3 judges. They said discriminatory. And then in 1973, at the Supreme Court of Canada, 9 judges, all old elderly men, they did not recognize that particular section as being discriminatory, because they said I was treated like all the other Anishinaabe women in my situation, so obviously not discriminatory. And so this is the kind of discrimination that we've had to deal with. And then as Anishinaabe women, as a status woman, I lost my status, and therefore my children were not eligible. And thank goodness it's not that way today, but nevertheless, it is still discriminatory, and you will be hearing about that. But I guess what I would like to say is that if it took this long to make these changes, what about all those others? And this is just in our recognition, you know, of who we are. We are a strong nation of people. We have our language, we have some land left, we have our own sense of governance rather, our governments, and we have our culture. And we should be able to retain that nationality called Anishinaabe, the Anishinaabe nation. Well, I'm talking about Ontario. But if we go right across Canada, many of our people feel the same. And I know in Quebec that you have so many nations there and they have that connection to the land. But here we're still dealing with our resources. We've been able to make changes with our recognition, with our status. But what about the resources right now? The big dilemma, and this is International Water Recognition Day, and my dear friend who's now gone into the spirit world, Josephine Mandaman, worried and tried to do so much to protect our water, to make it viable and healthy. Water is a living entity and it's been given to us for our health, for the health of our communities, the health of our people, and for future generations. And she worked really hard. And we still haven't been able to do that much, but maybe collectively, as I said, we are stubborn and we will not forget. So we are at that point. I did get my 6-1A status back. And as I said, it took 50 years. And Sharon has been making changes for my children and grandchildren. And hopefully we will not have to deal with this kind of issue anymore. And I give thanks to the Creator that I've been able to see these changes within my community, to see so many young people there, and they're proud of who they are, and they want to learn the language, and they're recognizing our leadership, and especially the role of women within our community. And that is so important. So it's going to be up to us as Anishinaabe women, Anishinaabe Quake, we say, to continue to speak out, to continue to strive for our role as women within our nations, and to do whatever we can. And I am counting on all the younger women within our nations. Younger women, I mean Sharon, I mean Pam, and my daughter, Dawn Wabmimi, who's also president of the Ontario Native Women's Association. And my granddaughter is now she's on the board as well. But this is our role. We follow in the footsteps of our grandmothers, our aunties, and the women within our community. And within my clan, which is the Bird clan, it's the Black Hawk clan. This is our role, is to provide that leadership in terms of making change within our community. So I think I've been speaking too long. Someone was supposed to remind me, but I'll just say miigwech, and if anyone has a question about any of the events I've been through, be more than glad to answer as best I can. Aha, miigwech givesenduek.
Miigwech, merci. Merci, Madame Corbière-Laveule. Alors maintenant, je vous présente notre deuxième panéliste. Il s'agit de Sharon McCarver. Alors, Sharon McCarver est une femme des Premières Nations, membre de la bande autochtone de Lower Nicola. Elle est également une avocate reconnue, non seulement pour son excellence en enseignement au Nicola Valley Institute of Technology à mérite en Colombie-Britannique, mais aussi par la gouvernance générale du Canada, par la gouverneure générale du Canada, pardon, pour sa bataille de 30 ans pour l'égalité pour les femmes autochtones. Alors, Madame Sharon McCarver, à vous la parole.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, Vivienne, for inviting me to be part of this today. I'm honored to be here, and I'm happy to tell you a little of what I know. I also want to acknowledge that there are many of us that have been acting and fighting for a long time to get all of these inequalities out of the law. Now, how do we get it out of people's mind? I'm not sure, but if we can get it out of the law, that's a big step. I also want to acknowledge the women some of the women that went before me. They won't be all of them. Mary Tuack Shirley, Jenny Margetts, Nellie Carlson, and of course, Jeanette, who started challenging the government. And then there's Sandra Lovelace, but for all of the work that went ahead of us, we wouldn't have been able to move forward like we did. So I want to make sure that I acknowledge those women and the others that fought hard. And many of them died without being able to take their rightful place in their communities. I also wanted to say that it's been 153 years since that first piece of legislation happened and gave the authority of Indian and land reserved for Indians to the federal government. And over the years, there are numerous Indian acts that have happened over and over and over again. And it had up until the 1950s, it had a common theme. It actually took all rights away from Indians. In the Indian Act, in its various formation over the years, there was a word called person. You're a person. And at law, or in law, person means that you're able to look after yourself. You're able to make decisions for yourself. And if you want to sue somebody, you can sue somebody. So people under the age of majority, usually under the age of 18, are not persons because they can't sue without somebody standing in their place to help them. But the word persons in the Indian Act, the definition was anyone other than an Indian. So we were not persons, and some of us were born before it would change. So we were born without being recognized as a person. And so the law over the years has done various things. As Jeanette had explained, well, if you're an Indian woman who's recognized by the government, that's what status is. They recognize, if you're recognized by the government, and then you married a man that was not recognized, they immediately took away your recognition. Your status was gone. You weren't allowed to do a whole lot of things like eat your family's food if it was caught under their Aboriginal right, or be able to live with them on the land. So it's been, and there's variations throughout the years, and that one was the big one. It didn't change in 1985 when it was supposed to change because the equality rights of the charter kicked in. They changed it, but really marginally. And so that was Jeanette sued under the old act. I sued under the new act, and was marginally successful. Women who married out got back their status in 1985, and their first generation children did. And I challenged that because my children weren't eligible to be registered. So I challenged it, started in 1989, got into court in 2006, got a decision in 2007, appealed, it was appealed, and it was appealed. And the last appeal was in 2000, and we got a decision, and government was forced to change the law, and they did change it effective 2011, January 2011. They put into place the grandchildren. My grandchildren were then eligible. And we continued the fight. You know, they say, okay, and we're back to where sort of back to where we should have been. Let's continue on, because there were the men's descendants that were born before April the 17th, 1985, had full status. That meant that they could pass it on regardless of who the partner was. And we could not. And as Jeanette said, she's a 6-1A now. Well, we weren't 6-1As. We were relegated to another section, 6-1C, and that gave us the ability to only pass it down to our grandchildren's generation. So many of us in the room here, 4 of us anyway, have been warriors getting after the government, going to the United Nations, going to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, getting those outside bodies to tell Canada, you're not living up to your convention. Canada, you're discriminating against Indigenous women. Canada, because the discrimination in the Indian Act, you've got hundreds of missing and murdered Indigenous women. And that's because of that discrimination in the Indian Act. And we're really a pain to the government. They did, every time anything came up around this legislation, we were there. The 4 of us here were there telling the government, you're discriminating, you've got to do it. And finally, on August the 15th, 2019, which was not all that long ago, a year and a half ago, they changed the law. So anybody who was born, and this is the important part, anyone who was born before April the 17th, 1985, and you're a descendant from a woman who had been married out at one point, you get to have full status. No second generation cutoff in that regard. And so there are pieces in the Indian Act that are still discriminatory, but those of you who are a descendant of a woman who married out, and if you're born before April the 17th, 1985, you've got to go and get your status upgraded, because that will mean your children, and if your children were born before April the 17th, 1985, they get full status and they can pass it down another generation. So part of what we wanted to do with this webinar is to let you know there are changes to the Indian Act. And if any of you out there are interested, or you know that you've got an ancestor that married out, a lot of the Métis people, well, if they had a grandmother that married out, or great-grandmother that married out, or great-great-great-grandmother who married out, they're eligible for status, and they should be thinking about it. So, there's a lot of things that we can talk about, but what we wanted you to know, that there's a good chance that if you're a descendant from a woman who married out, married a non-Indian woman or man and lost her status, there's a good chance that you're eligible for status. And we that have been fighting want you to go and do that. We want you to get your status. We want you to get recognized. And it's a birthright. It's not something that the government gives you. You were born with this right. And the only thing that we've done over the years is we've made the government recognize that you have that right. So we really want you to go and get the information you need to get yourself recognized and officially join us. I know that even though you might not have status, that doesn't mean that you're not part of us, but we would really like you to get recognized and start exercising those rights that you have as a status person. You've got, rights to go back onto your land. You've got rights to get medical and dental education, all of that. And those are birthrights. Those are the rights that we got as a result of the government taking the land. You know, it's not a taxpayer's burden. They're making money off every piece of land that they've taken from us. We're not getting any of it. And they're paying us back by giving us a few benefits when we're recognized. So that's it.
Thank you very much. Merci. Alors maintenant, je vous présente notre troisième et dernière panéliste, Madame Pamela Palmater. Pamela Palmater est une avocate, éducatrice et chroniqueuse Mi'kmaq, primée qui a écrit pour Maclean's, Chatelaine, Global Mail, Canadian Dimension and The Lawyer's Daily sur un large éventail de questions politiques, juridiques et économiques touchant les peuples autochtones du Canada et des États-Unis. Ses apparitions dans les médias et ses chroniques, ainsi que son blog, ses balados et ses vidéos font partie de sa mission d'éduquer les Canadiens et les Canadiennes sur la réconciliation avec les peuples autochtones. Elle est actuellement professeure et titulaire de la chaire de gouvernance autochtone à l'Université de Ryerson. Madame Palmater, à vous la parole.
Merci beaucoup, mes amis. Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente Vivienne. Vous êtes ma sœur, ma héroïne et une guerrière pour toutes les femmes. Merci beaucoup pour tout votre travail. C'est un honneur pour moi de participer dans les discussions très importantes avec tout le monde, toutes les femmes ici. Kwe Nindaluizi Pampameter. I'm from the sovereign Mi'kmaq Nation, an unceded Mi'kmaqi territory, and I am so excited to be here. Every time I get to work with Vivienne and all the people from Quebec Native women, I mean, you're all such warriors and you always get me super excited. I'm so honored. And of course, being here with all of the people that I truly respect. I mean, Mary Tuax early from Ganawage and Jeanette, obviously from Wiki, Yvonne Bedard, who was in that case with Jeanette from Six Nations, Sandra Lovelace Nicholas from back home. She's from Tobic First Nation. And of course, Sharon. I mean, these are the women who are our grandmothers. And I know they all touch me very deeply. I mean, my grandmother went from being Mi'kmaq to not Mi'kmaq to Mi'kmaq, but a lower level of Mi'kmaq. And my dad is like back and forth. And so the government has wielded this paternalistic, racist, sexist power over Native women and our children for the purposes of extinguishing us, like literally legislating us out of existence and trying to destroy our nations. But they couldn't. Didn't mean we didn't take casualties. They tried everything they could through genocide, everything to try to get rid of our nations. But we as women warriors, we stopped that. So I think it's important to honor those women. And there's so many other women that we can't possibly name, all of the ones who really fought to keep us together with our communities and our nations. And I think it's important in all of this that we celebrate their successes. And every success that we have, every time we bring someone back into our nation, that's a success. Every time we bring our children home, that's a success. But at the same time, it is so important not to give up the battle until we have full and complete justice and until we have reparations for what they did to us. They can never, ever put us back in the same place that we would have been had they not discriminated against our grandmothers and our great-grandmothers and our children. There's just no way to do that. They have done irreparable harm. So reparations are due. And it's also important to remember that even though the legislation has changed, not much has changed on the ground. Hundreds of thousands of Native women and children and grandchildren are still not registered, are still not band members because of the purposeful actions of Indian Affairs. They don't inform people. They use the pandemic as an excuse to all but halt registrations. They try to use the legislation to insulate themselves from liability for all of the harms that they caused. I mean, they will stop at nothing to wear out the clock on our rights. Their hope is that this legislative extinction clock that is still very much the basis of Indian registration will run itself out before they have to sign another treaty, negotiate another land claim, or compensate us for what they have done wrong. And that's why the battle isn't over for us. Just because they passed S3, where's all these women that are supposed to be registered? In fact, they're not getting their priority vaccines because they're not registered. They're not getting First Nations specific pandemic supports because they're not registered. Children are being denied critical access to health services because they're at the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal fighting against providing those services to non-status Indian children who should be registered, but for the fact that Indian Affairs is taking its good old time to register our kids and grandkids. It is unconscionable in this country that has a constitution, a charter of rights, Canadian human rights legislation, and every protection imaginable for women. They don't apply it to Indian women, and they won't do it voluntarily. We have had to drag them kicking and screaming to the courts for them to do that, and we're going to have to keep dragging them before every parliamentary committee, every Senate committee, the Inter-American Commission, the United Nations, and the courts if we have to, in the streets if we have to, because my sisters, the battle isn't over. Despite all of our successes, the battle is not over. And it's not just about these provisions where women were disqualified because of their sex for having married out. Even today, even with the passage of S3, there is still a whole raft, a whole list of areas that are still discriminatory that have not been addressed by Bill S3. And I talked about some of them, the fact that they're not registering people on time, the fact that they have done nothing to address all of the First Nation women, children, and grandchildren who should be band members, but they aren't because of past discriminatory Indian Act provisions. Because as of 1985, bands could adopt their own membership codes, which may or may not be in alignment with Indian status. The only people that they had to include in their membership codes were the ones at that time. Ever since then, there's been no legislative obligation for them to include anyone from C3 amendments or anyone from S3 amendments. And that creates a whole list of problems when you can't be a band member. Similarly, the length of time that it takes and has taken for them to process applications for Indian status. So under Bill C-31, some people waited 7 years to get registered. It's absolutely not at all justified. So those 7 years of not being registered, that's ongoing discrimination. They can process passports in a matter of days if you pay an extra fee. So you mean to tell me you can't register Indian women within a 7-year span? The same thing happened with Bill C-3. You've got some women and children waiting years to be registered. Even now with S-3, years. And that's despite the fact that they have the capacity, they have the human resources, and they have the money. They certainly haven't transferred it to us. So all of this is ongoing discrimination that we have to hold them to account for. And the issue of compensation in Bill C-31, Canada argued that, well, the Charter of Rights didn't apply prior to 1982, so you can't retroactively look back and make us accountable for sex discrimination. That was their excuse. Well, when C-3 was passed, from 1982 to 2010, the Charter was in place. Canada had no excuse for discriminating against Indigenous women. How is it that they decided to insulate themselves from liability in C3 so that we couldn't seek reparations? They did the same thing in S3. They're trying to insulate themselves from reparations. But the amazing thing that Sharon's court case did, and not just her court case, but she also took Canada to the United Nations Human Rights Committee. And the Human Rights Committee is saying, not only do you have to register Sharon as a 6-1A, not only do you have to make sure that there's no more discrimination going forward, but you also have to make reparations. And that's where Canada is falling down, because they know that that would probably be the biggest settlement that there ever was in terms of all of the reparations, all of the lost programs and services, all of the lost treaty rights, all of the lost land claims, all of the lost language and culture, and the ability just to vote or run in elections. So all of these things, they're on the hook for. Every per capita payment that was ever made when we were excluded, that is rightfully owed to us, not from the bands, but from the federal government, because it was the federal government's sexually discriminatory, racially discriminatory legislation that kicked us out. And they have a lot to account for. Think about this. The charter groups or the beginner list for any of the self-governing nations, they were based on the band lists, the Indian status lists that were sex and race discriminatory. So you've got all of these self-government agreements where thousands of women and children were excluded from voting in, having a voice in, or being included in the charter list. And that's self-governing First Nations. So they have a lot to account for that. But think of every time some kind of treaty was signed, or a land claim was signed, and a per capita payment was made, or money went into trust. None of that has come to First Nations. And then, of course, they haven't properly resolved unknown or unstated paternity. They still don't have a very clear indication of what to do when a woman doesn't know who the father is, or when the woman has been sexually assaulted, or some other reason why she might not state the name of the father. They provided clarity in S3, but not real clarity. How they haven't shown how they have registered the tens of thousands of children who should be registered, but were disqualified because of this unknown and unstated paternity policy. And of course, I mean, it goes on and on. You've got issues around enfranchisement and Section 6.2. I mean, Section 6.2 is the legislative extinction provision. That's the provision that says 2 generations of marrying out and no one's an Indian anymore. No Indians mean no band members. No band members means no band. No band means all of the land, all of the resources, all of the treaty rights, they escheat to the crown. And escheat means it all legally reverts back to the federal or provincial crown. And in most cases, it's the provincial crown. So think about that. The government has been celebrating itself for remedying sex discrimination. Man, they have only been forced to address the tip of the iceberg. So the rest of the battle is still before us. And I think it's really important that we don't forget that we educate one another, and that we continue to put pressure in all forums to make sure that they address this, because we know they're not going to do it voluntarily. And I think, you know, warrior organizations like the Quebec Native Women are just the ones to do it. And I'm really excited to be part of this. You can probably tell I'm a little bit enthusiastic, but that's because I know the power of the women. None of what's happened already would have happened without individual women doing this, with women supporting them. And I know we will get to the other end of full justice and full reparations if we all work on this together. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you to the three of you. It was very inspiring. C'était très inspirant. Merci à toutes les trois. Alors maintenant, nous en sommes rendus à la période de questions et réponses. Alors, je sais qu'il y a eu des questions qui ont été écrites, posées dans le question-réponse, dans le chat. Léa et Colette vont les gérer. Mais en fait, n'hésitez pas à lever la main si vous voulez poser vos questions de vive voix. Alors, oui. Suzanne Chenier, à vous la parole. On ne vous entend pas. Peut-être qu'il faut...
Unmute. Là, est-ce que vous m'entendez?
Tout à fait. Allez-y, Suzanne.
Je suis Suzanne Chenier. Je suis membre du groupe d'Amnesty International Saint-Jérôme-Laurentide. Je voulais vous remercier, mesdames, du fond du cœur. Vous êtes très inspirantes. Et je me demandais qu'est-ce que nous, les non-autochtones, les femmes non-autochtones, peuvent faire pour vous aider dans vos revendications. Merci,
Suzanne. Est-ce qu'il y a l'une de vous trois qui se porte volontaire pour répondre à Madame Chenier? Prenez le micro. Pamela, Sharon, Jeannette, Viviane.
Jeanette or Sharon, do you want to go first? Oh. Okay, so we have been able to do all of this together with support from non-Native women. I mean, you know, women supporting women, that's super powerful. I mean, just look at who is sponsoring this event right here. You've got Amnesty International, lots of amazing women working there. You have the Feminist Alliance for International Action. I mean, I have been mentored by people at the Feminist Alliance. Sheila Day is one of those people. She's taught me about the international system. She helps keep us organized. She organizes meetings. I mean, there is no end to the help and assistance that non-Native women can provide under the leadership of Indigenous women. And I think it's really about figuring out what it is that you have to offer. Are you someone that has funding that you can support specific projects or research or smaller women's community groups? Do you have research skills that you can dedicate to these organizations? Are you a lawyer? Can you provide pro bono work when we're, you know, suing the government for these things? Are you a human rights expert at the international level where you can lend some of your expertise or your drafting skills? Are you an IT professional? Can you help update websites? Can you help inform people? I mean, it's really about you figure out what your skills are, how they might help lift some of the burden from us. Because the wrong way to do it is for 1,000 people to email us and say, what can we do? Because then that just puts all the burden on us. You figure out what you can do and say, here's what I have to offer. And if it doesn't work for the first person, it might work for someone else. But we welcome it. We've always worked with non-Native women. We've worked with women from all backgrounds because these are important feminist issues, and there is no equality for women so long as Native women are still suffering from inequality. And that's where non-Native women can really stand up, use your power, your wealth, your influence, and your numbers to make noise and keep on the pressure and don't give up until they do what they're supposed to do.
Thank you. I don't know if Janet or Sharon have something to add. Otherwise, no. Otherwise, pardon, je parle en français, c'est vrai. Je vais passer la parole à Léa qui a compilé, colligé les questions dans le chat et les questions-réponses. Alors peut-être que Léa, tu peux nous en faire part de quelques-unes et après je retournerai aux mains levées.
Oui, merci. So we have a specific question. to one of you. So your struggle to regain your status is inspiring. My daughter has not reached the age of majority. However, when she does, the laws state that she would apply to Indian Act 51(1). So it means subject to this section, all jurisdiction and authority in relation to the property of mentally incompetent Indians is vested exclusively in the minister. I worry about her future. How can I advocate better for her future? So one of you can answer this.
Alors, laquelle voudrait répondre? Janet, Sharon, Pamela? Janet, il faudrait ouvrir votre micro, on ne vous entend pas. You have to open your mic. Yeah.
Okay. I guess all I want to say is I'm not really understanding the question, so I would leave it to Sharon or Pam.
So I think, Sharon, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not an expert on the internal Indian affairs policies in relation to mentally incompetent Indians. However, there is a section under the Indian Act that gives all of the authority to the minister to appoint people to administer the property or estates of people that have been deemed to be mentally incompetent Indians. So there's internal INAC processes. The courts are often involved. It would have health professionals involved in that. So that's not a question I don't think that any of us could answer here just generally speaking. It's so fact specific that that's a question that you should really bring to a legal aid lawyer or a family lawyer or someone who works in that area to talk about how to deal with the property of someone who presumably has mental health issues or needs someone to in a power of attorney kind of position, because those Indian Act provisions, they're obviously archaic, but INAC has internal policies around that.
OK, je crois que c'est Madame Robertson qui avait posé la question. Est-ce que ça répond à votre question, Madame Elisabeth Robertson? Alors, sinon, je passe la parole à Mary Annaberg. Il faut ouvrir votre micro pour qu'on vous entende. Mary Annaberg. Alors,
do you hear me? Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, super loud.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Hi. Hello. Bonjour. Kwegwe. I want to just thank you all, you warrior women, strong women, very intelligent, long battle fighters. Know you for many years. I just wanted to say to that woman from Laval, if she wants to become a friend of, because we have friends of the Organization for Quebec Native Women, you can join and you can support and be keep up to date and some of the tasks that we take on. If she wants to participate and keep very connection and get updated information. Also, sometimes we do have marches. Sometimes we do have petitions she wants to sign. So we can keep in a link. She can become a friend of the Organization of Quebec Native Women. And we have many friends, as Viviane had stated, our president Viviane Michel has stated. We have many friends of the organization, and we're always welcoming new people to join because, you know, there are strength in numbers. I want to thank you too, Pam Palmater, very much, because you really were very clear on, you know, what are the things that need to happen. And you have such a passion in your voice. So, you know, you really motivate me. Thank you so much. And all the other women as well. Jeanette Lavelle, Sharon MacGyver, who said she would never give up fighting. I asked her to promise, you know, even when we had to, you know, take little bits and pieces here and there. And it seemed like at times we were going against each other in this fight. We were waiting so long, but Sharon always kept on going, you know, as all the other women. I want to thank you very much. Thank you so much.
Merci, Kwekwe Mary. Maintenant, je passe la parole à Catherine Soucy. Vous pouvez ouvrir votre micro est fermé.
Oui, vous m'entendez?
On vous entend.
Parfait. En fait, je vais poser ma question en anglais. I'm presently a lawyer in Quebec. My issue is not with clients being denied status, but it's band membership. And usually their kids do get band membership. Their husband has band membership. Their parents has band membership. But then there's a great-great-grandfather that married outside. So I have many cases like that right now in front of the the Commission of Human Rights. And I was wondering if you had any advice on how to approach such cases.
OK, alors merci Madame Soucy. Qui voudrait répondre à Madame Soucy?
J'aimerais répondre.
Oui.
Moi, je pourrais dire que, écoutez, ça, c'est vraiment un enjeu qui touche l'identité, l'appartenance à une communauté, évidemment. Et ça a été un impact chez les femmes qui ont perdu leur statut. Et par la suite, même s'il y a eu la loi C-31, même s'il y a eu la loi C-3, les 40 000 Autochtones qui étaient en attente d'être réinscrits, même s'il y a eu la loi S3 aussi, les changements où est-ce qu'on dit que oui, il y a la discrimination basée sur le genre, les changements ne sont pas encore apportés à l'intérieur des communautés. Les communautés autochtones ne sont pas préparées justement encore lorsqu'on parle de code d'appartenance, lorsqu'on parle aussi de code de citoyenneté. Au Québec, il n'y a pas grand communautés qui ont ce code d'appartenance. Je sais que chez les Abénaquis, ils ont une grande longueur d'avance, OK? Et ça peut sembler aussi problématique parce que si on a marché, deux petites madames qui ont marché, Viviane Michel et Michel Audette, de Wendake jusqu'à Ottawa pour justement la réinscription de ces gens, on n'a pas senti un support de nos leaders politiques. Et je peux comprendre, je ne veux pas écraser nos leaders politiques. J'ai beaucoup de respect. Je parle de nos leaders autochtones. Je peux les comprendre parce que même si ces 40 000 Autochtones étaient réinscrits, le financement restait tel quel. Donc, on ne pouvait pas accueillir ça. C'est des impacts qu'il peut avoir. Donc, moi, je réponds en gros topo de ce genre, mais je vais laisser mes consoeurs continuer.
Merci, Viviane. Alors, je passe la parole maintenant à Madame Shilagde. Vous pouvez ouvrir votre micro. You have to open your mic.
Okay, I will speak later.
Okay. Oh, now go. If you don't mind, Mrs. Day, we will let Janet answer. Go ahead, Janet.
Okay. Just to get back to the question about getting our communities, our First Nations, to recognize those members who are entitled to be recognized. What our experience within my community, and I'm also the Commissioner of Citizenship, which in our language we call Edbendausajik, those who belong. After years of consultation and looking at what is happening within our communities, where because of the old status rules, some of our communities were down to their last status member. And so as it was pointed out by Pamela, once you don't have any status members within a reserve, then that reserve presumably is can be taken over by the government. So that is a real problem. But the Anishinaabe Nation in Ontario, what our citizenship code at Vendauxajik says is, if you can trace your ancestry, direct ancestry on either side, your mother's side or your dad's side, back to someone who had status or belonged to a community, and it can be verified because there's still members around church records and different records, then you are entitled to be recognized. That is what our solution was, because we feel that we cannot afford to lose any of our people who are entitled to be recognized as part of our nation, or who want to be returning back home. They have that sense of belonging. They know that they're connected. They have ancestors there. And so that sense of belonging is so important. So it can be done. The only difficulty is that the government of Canada will not recognize what our code says. So right now, we are looking at 3 areas within a new piece of, I wouldn't say it's legislation, but it's governance, where our communities will be able to make our own laws within our communities. One of the areas is in citizenship. So if the community says, yes, we will recognize all these people, you know, here's the criteria, then that's good, that can happen. Also in our band elections, we don't need to follow the old criteria of electing a chief and how that's been done. So that could also be taken over. And then the governance, making our own laws. We have our own constitutions. So that is also can be put in place by our people within our communities. And then the last one has to do with language and culture. Those 4 areas are open for us to decide, and we can make those provisions or codes or laws, however we want to do it. So you would have to check back, I would think, with your own community and see if they have taken that option. See if they're willing to go that route. And maybe it needs some people to speak out and say, this is the way our people were prior to the Indian Act, prior to 153 years ago. Our people, we recognize all the members within our community. We didn't ask them, you know, what their status was or anything. They were there, part of that community. And that's what we are striving for as a strong Anishinaabe nation. Miigwech.
Miigwech, est-ce que Sharon ou Pamela, vous aviez quelque chose à ajouter? Pamela?
Yeah, I will say something here. It really depends on why they're not getting band membership. You know, in 1985, they did split membership and status. So the government of Canada still determines the status, and they left it up to the individual bands to decide whether they're going to put in place a membership code or not. And so it really depends, you know, is there a code there and they don't qualify under the code. And I think she said that they're going to the Human Rights Commission to look at that. But if there's a code in place and the code's discriminatory, that can be challenged. But it really depends on why they're being denied membership.
Okay, thank you. Pamela?
Yeah, and I was just going to add to what Sharon said, that we've got to be able to isolate the two issues. So Canada discriminatorily underfunds First Nations for all programs and services with or without these new women. So that's an issue that we need to hammer Canada on. The fact that they don't provide extra money for the new members, that's discrimination that shouldn't be borne by the women. That's discrimination that Canada should be held accountable. If we're talking about legal challenges specifically, keep in mind that I have yet to find a traditional Indigenous law that allowed sex discrimination against women in terms, so you couldn't rely on an Indigenous law to defend sex discrimination if the issue is sex discrimination. Canada's charter applies to First Nations that protects Section 15 is the equality provision. Under the Canada Human Rights Act, you can't discriminate on the basis of sex. Ever since Section 67 of the Canada Human Rights Act was repealed, that applies to First Nations with due regard to their customs and laws. But I've yet to hear one that has a law that allows sex discrimination. And then don't forget, some First Nations will argue they have a Section 35 Aboriginal right to determine their own citizenship, which I totally support. But Section 35 is qualified by Section 35(4), which says that all Aboriginal and treaty rights are guaranteed equally to male and female people. And then some First Nations rely on UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And don't forget the provisions in UNDRIP says not only do all international human rights apply, which protects against sex discrimination, but all of the rights in UNDRIP are protected equally for male and female Indigenous peoples. So there is no legal avenue for a government or First Nation to discriminate against women. Because here's the thing, I believe very firmly in our sovereignty as nations, and I will always defend it. But sovereignty also has limits, and those limits are human rights, where we live in a global community. There's no state in the world that is just sovereign and isn't bound by some form of limitation, just like First Nations are. So I just don't see the legal ability to exclude on the basis of sex. There may be other issues, but there's just simply no legal avenue left for any First Nation to say these women or their descendants should be excluded on the basis of sex.
Yes, thank you. Okay, I think
Juste rajouter quelque chose, moi, très court. Moi, je trouve ça vraiment débile où est-ce qu'on est rendu. Tout ce processus, justement, qui vise à discriminer les femmes, mais tout ce processus, savez-vous que c'est pas nous qui choisissons qui est autochtone ou pas autochtone, c'est un petit fonctionnaire qui reçoit une demande dans son bureau et qui n'a jamais rencontré la personne et qui va peut-être dire oui ou non. C'est ça qui est débile dans tout ce processus.
Merci, Viviane. Alors, j'ai 5 mains levées et il y a aussi des questions qui ont été posées par écrit. Donc, je vais passer la parole à Madame Sheila Day, cette fois-ci pour vrai, Madame Day. Et ensuite de ça, je vais aller vers Léa qui va poser les questions un peu en rafale, celles qui ont été écrites. Et je reviens vers Madame Roberts et Madame Bois. Alors, Madame Day, à vous la parole.
Thank you very much for recognizing me. I think it would be better to go on to the other speakers who have good questions that should get the airtime. Thanks so much. I really enjoyed this. It's been a great panel. Thanks for doing it. Bye.
Thank you, Mrs. Day. Alors, Léa, est-ce que tu as des questions, compris les questions qui ont été posées dans le Q&R?
Oui, alors, j'ai une question. Many of my clients are denied band membership in their community, yet they were able to get their...
Cette question-là a été posée à l'oral par Madame Soucy, Léa.
OK, j'ai une autre question sur les statuts. Dans le fond, c'est par rapport à ce qu'a dit Mme Sharon McIver. Sharon a dit que toutes les femmes qui ont perdu leur statut en mariant en blanc et qui l'ont récupéré ont donné leur statut complet à tous ses descendants nés avant le 17 avril 1985. Cela porte à confusion. Je pensais que c'était aux enfants seulement des femmes qui avaient perdu leur statut et non les petits-enfants.
Madame McCarver?
Okay, well, that was true up until the 15th of August, 2019. And on the 15th of August, 2019, the government declared law the section that basically says if you're a descendant of a woman who married out and you were born before April the 17th, 1985, then you get status. You're entitled to status. And not only are you entitled to status, you're entitled to full status. It means that you can pass it down to another generation. So that it wasn't in effect until about a year and a half ago, a little over a year and a half ago. And so it was something that we had fought for when they changed the law in 1985. All of the people that had status or were entitled to status before April the 17th, 1985 were registered under section 6(1)(a). And those who got status returned to them or were descendants of people who got status returned to them, they were under another section. As women who married out, we came in under section 6(1)(c). And as the children of the women who married out, they were initially section 6(2), meaning that if you're registered under section 6(2), that is that you've got one Indian parent and one non-Indian parent. And if you have one Indian parent and one non-Indian parent, you're entitled to registration, but it's under section 6(2). And if you're registered under section 6(2), you cannot pass your status on your own right. You can only pass it on if the other parent is an Indian as well. So that's what happened. And those of us who should have been, I've got brothers who are under section 6(1)(a) because they never lost their status. So their wife has status. My sister-in-law, who has no Indigenous ancestry, has status. My brother actually had two wives, both not recognized as Indians, neither of them, and they got status. And because they were officially an Indian and my brother's an Indian, their children got full status. And then their grandchildren got, depending on who the other parent was, got half status. So they let me go one generation, but my brother went 2 generations. And so we started arguing that, so no matter if your mom married out in 1932 and had you as a child, or had you, and then you had a child, well, then after the McIver case, mom already had her status, you got half status, and your children got none. They included the child. So, but if it was in 1932, and then the grandchildren should have had full status, not half status. So, and so we fought for that, and they agreed that anybody born coming down the female line that married out, born before April the 17th, 1985, could have 6(1)(a) status. And so it is a change, and it's a major change. And so according to the government, that once that change was made in 2019, there would be 500,000 descendants, women and their descendants, that would be eligible for registration. And so that part of what we are doing today, thanks to Vivian, is trying to get the word out. You're entitled to status if you were you know, you can be fifth generation after the mom married out. But if you were born, or your mom was born before April the 17th, 1985, you get 618 status, the same as the men did. The men didn't get to marry out until after 1985. Now they're in the same situation as the women are. So, but it's not confusing, and it's really straightforward. If you're born before April the 17th, 1985, and one of your female ancestors had married out, you're entitled to full status.
Thank you, Mrs. McCarver. Madame Bois. Charlotte Bois, vous avez une question? Madame Bois.
OK, est-ce que ça marche? Oh.
Oui, ça marche.
OK. Yeah, I just wanted to know, because I live in downtown Montreal, and you know, you probably know the situation is pretty bad here. So when we witness a situation of like a cop being a racist asshole towards a native that's homeless, who are we supposed to call? Because I've seen something like that just yesterday. So, and I don't know who to tell or what to do, because the ones we're told to call in those situations are cops. So what are we supposed to do, you know?
Qui veut répondre? Peut-être Viviane, comme ça se passe à Montréal. Quelle est la ressource qu'il faut contacter?
Ben, écoutez, Madame Bois, ce que je peux vous dire et rassurer, c'est que Femmes autochtones du Québec se met en mode action, ce qui veut dire avec tout ce qui s'est passé. On prend les femmes autochtones disparues, assassinées, on prend la dénonciation de la brutalité policière en 2015. On peut prendre aussi la jeune Inuit qui a fait un appel à l'aide auprès de la SPVM, puis qu'on a retrouvé pendu le lendemain, qu'on ferme le dossier suicide sans entamer justement une enquête. Si on prend l'appel à l'aide justement d'une femme en détresse à Square Cabot, okay, et qu'on appelle le 911, on décrit que c'est une femme autochtone et que 17 policiers se rendent sur place avec les squads canines, c'est vraiment débile. Je peux vous assurer que juste pour le cas de la jeune femme où les 17 policiers se sont présentés, Femmes autochtones du Québec fait la défense des droits des femmes et a déposé une plainte à la Commission des droits de la personne par rapport à cette intervention exagérée. Où est-ce que vous pouvez aller chercher du support? Il y a quand même beaucoup d'organisations à l'intérieur de Montréal. On a Native Montréal, le Centre d'amitié, on a Women's Shelter, on a aussi Femmes autochtones du Québec, on a une analyse juridique politique qui travaille avec nous pour les lois. Et dans l'ensemble, il y a beaucoup de services. Donc, si vous avez besoin, écrivez-nous. Et on va vous diriger, on va vous référer sur un bon service.
OK. Merci, Viviane. Alors, il est déjà passé 19h30. Il ne nous reste plus vraiment beaucoup de temps. Il y a 2 mains levées et il y a encore quelques questions qui ont été posées via le question-réponse. Alors, Léa, je vais te passer la parole. J'aimerais que tu poses toutes les questions qui ont été écrites, une après l'autre. Nos conférencières prendront des notes et on leur passera la parole après pour répondre. Et je vais finir avec Mme Echaquan et Mme Roberts à la fin. Et ça sera tout. Alors, Léa.
Alors, il y a une question concernant le principe de Joyce, parce que le gouvernement du Québec a refusé d'adopter le principe de Joyce, mais quelles sont les actions qui sont mises en place? Est-ce qu'il y a des collaborations entre femmes autochtones qui se font pour réagir? Et est-ce qu'il existe un réseau international de femmes autochtones pour justement échanger par rapport aux expériences des femmes à travers le monde, des femmes autochtones? Donc, c'était la question résumée.
Bon, écoutez, pour le principe de Joyce, comme je l'ai dit dans ma présentation, on a une résolution de nos membres qui dit de passer à l'adoption du principe de Joyce. Et les événements de Joyce ont été vraiment présents, que ce soit via les médias, que ce soit les réseaux sociaux, évidemment. Et on a quand même porté notre aide à la communauté de Manawan, dont le chef Ottawa, évidemment. Et on a rencontré aussi le mari de Joyce pour lui donner notre support et aussi tendre la main pour, peu importe l'action qu'il voulait mener, qu'on était présent et qu'on était prête à les supporter et à les soutenir. Ça, c'est vraiment en gros ce qu'on a fait, là. Et pour ce qui est justement du principe de Joyce, je pense on fait très attention de ne pas se faire une image avec des tristes événements. On sait qu'il y a beaucoup trop d'événements parfois, où est-ce que des tristes événements, on s'approprie des événements tristes pour se donner une bonne image. C'est vraiment pas notre cas. Ce qu'on a dit au chef, c'est qu'on est avec vous, on est derrière vous, vous nous faites signe si vous avez besoin de nous parce que Femmes autochtones du Québec est une organisation reconnue régionalement, nationalement et internationalement. Donc, on se dote aussi des outils internationaux dont les Nations unies. Je suis très contente que la nation Atikamekw, la communauté de Manawan, vont apporter le principe de Jordan aux Nations unies. Vous savez, quand ça ne marche pas au Québec, il y a encore des instances encore plus haut et plus importantes qui est dans les Nations unies, où est-ce qu'il va être déposé le refus justement de l'adoption du principe de Joyce.
Merci, Viviane. Alors, Madame Adjoke, Stella Adjoke.
Oui, bonjour.
Bonjour.
Miigwech, merci beaucoup pour cette rencontre franchement nourrissante, je vous dirais, à mon niveau. En tant que femme noire à moitié, née ici en ville, à Montréal, je suis obligée de me sentir extrêmement liée à vos luttes parce que c'est une réalité où moi, personnellement, ce sont des membres de différentes communautés autochtones qui m'ont fait prendre conscience de ma condition de femme noire au Canada. Donc, le fait de participer collectivement avec des personnes des Premières Nations m'a moi-même éclairé sur un chemin de colonisation que les populations noires ont subi de manière terrible et qui fait qu'on est dans une certaine inertie. Moi, ce sont des membres des communautés des Premières Nations qui m'ont réveillé à mon histoire, à mes racines et aux besoins d'identité. Donc, je veux dire merci grandement parce que c'est un cadeau immensurable. Dans ça, je ne peux pas m'empêcher de voir énormément de liens dans nos réalités de femmes, dans nos réalités où il y a beaucoup de femmes noires aussi qui vont de l'avant pour défendre la vie nécessairement. Et avec les tristes incidents de Joyce Echaquan, il y a eu après Mireille Ngogo qui a été poussée à mort aussi à l'hôpital Charlemagne dernièrement au mois de mars. Donc, justice pour Joyce, justice pour Mireille. Moi, je suis concernée en ce moment avec tout ce qui se passe dans le monde, avec tout ce qui se passe ici au Québec, la situation COVID qui affecte d'autant plus les membres de chacune de nos communautés d'une manière, je pense, similaire parce qu'on se retrouve en prison ensemble plus que dans notre épanouissement. Et dans tout ça, je me demande comment on peut lier nos voix par rapport au principe de Joyce, par exemple, comment on peut mieux lier nos voix au niveau politique? Parce que je crois qu'en ce moment, le principe de Joyce répond aussi à ce que beaucoup de communautés noires en auraient besoin comme service en ville. Je vais parler plutôt en ville, parce qu'on se retrouve dans des réalités où on est divisé dans nos communautés noires et on est très vulnérable quand on a besoin de faire...
Excusez-moi, Madame Adjoké, il faut raccourcir. Donc, votre question, c'est comment unir nos voix?
Oui, c'est ça. Comment mieux faire? Excusez, c'est émotionnel.
Non, c'est très juste ce que vous disiez, mais malheureusement, on manque de temps. Donc, comment unir les voix des différentes femmes des communautés autochtones, noires, racisées? Sur le principe de Joyce notamment, Viviane?
Je voulais entendre les guerrières aussi. Écoutez, comment unir nos voix. Je l'avais écrit, moi, dans mes notes pour la fin, mais les gens demandent toujours comment on peut aider, surtout les gens qui ne sont pas autochtones. Vous savez, vous avez élu votre propre gouvernement. Je pense que faire des pressions auprès de vos gouvernements serait vraiment très apprécié. Se joindre à nos luttes, nous supporter, nous soutenir, je pense que ce sont des bons points. Unir nos voix, si je prends la population noire, Stella Adjoké, celle que l'on doit chérir, je pense qu'on vit les problématiques similaires. La population noire et la population autochtone, on a vécu la discrimination. Vous avez vécu l'esclavage, mais nous, on a vécu le génocide aussi. Donc, nos enjeux se ressemblent. Et comment les rassembler? C'est là, si tu es prête, ben, est-ce que tu as d'autres personnes? Je pense qu'il n'y a pas encore d'union de fait. Pour l'instant, peuple noir et peuple autochtone, ce serait peut-être un bel avancement, mais je te lance la perche, tu as du travail à faire, c'est là.
Merci, Viviane. Alors, peut-être que je passerai maintenant à la dernière question de Mme Nancy Roberts et ensuite de ça, je vais passer un mot de la fin à chacune de nos conférencières, de nos guerrières. Alors, Mme Roberts?
Okay, hi, can you hear me?
Oui.
Okay, so my name is Nancy Robertson. I'm a proud Quebecer, originally from the same community as Viviane. I have actually 3 questions. I'll try to do this quickly. So as a first part, I'd like to say thank you to all of you. And I'd like you to know that I had the great opportunity to help many people in Montreal who were seeking help to help them research with their genealogical tree. So many of them, I gave them a hand with the research, and they were interested in seeking for the Indian status afterwards. So I gave them a good hand with that. And I also, on the other side, have the chance to meet people who didn't want nothing to do with seeking any kind of Indian status, yet they were Indians living on the land. So now I'll switch off to French for the questions. Before, I'd like to say what I find sad in all these issues is that it brings us to many conflictual situations among our own women. And that's where I want to get, because j'écoutais Viviane tantôt parler de la discrimination basée sur le genre. Mais moi, ce que je trouve dans tous ces processus-là, c'est que c'est une atteinte, une grave atteinte à nos structures matriarcales. C'est qu'avec tout ça, on a cherché à nous imposer le patriarcat et c'est encore le cas aujourd'hui. Fait que ça, je ne sais pas si dans les revendications qui sont mises de l'avant, vous faites mention de cette atteinte-là à notre structure qui était particulièrement riche et comment il porte atteinte et comment encore aujourd'hui on impose ce patriarcat-là à nos structures qui, en fait, sont à la recherche justement quand on parle de réappropriation culturelle et tout ça, c'est de reconnaître en grosse partie que nos structures avaient le privilège d'être des structures matriarcales avec toutes les différences qu'on connaît. ensuite de ça, pour ce qui en est ça c'était une première question. Je vais vous laisser répondre après. Ma deuxième question, c'est à l'égard du racisme systémique. Parce que j'ai énormément de difficultés avec le terme systémique. Je suis bien d'accord, il y a énormément de racisme. Il y a des situations qui sont vraiment inacceptables sur beaucoup de territoires ici. Mais est-ce que l'appellation systémique est appropriée? Je fais référence à un travail que j'ai eu la chance de faire où je parlais justement de comment est-ce que quand on est avec des populations vulnérables qui ont tendance à se cantonner dans des histoires collectives ou personnelles, puis ça les aide pas du tout à améliorer leurs conditions actuelles, à faire face à la situation. Ça peut être du racisme, ça peut être d'autres types de violences, mais la situation est réelle, elle est présente. Fait que c'est un peu ma crainte avec l'appellation systémique dans tout ça, c'est que la réalité, elle est là, elle est maintenant.
Parfait.
Alors, il ne faudrait pas aller se...
Merci, Mme Robertson.
La dernière intervention, c'est justement juste traduire, c'est qu'on sent qu'il y a beaucoup de blessures chez nos femmes et ça se fait sentir partout, je trouve, dans l'ensemble des communautés, peu importe où ce qu'on soit en ville, qu'on soit dans nos collectivités respectives. Et ça, je trouve ça bien triste. Merci.
Merci, Mme Robertson. Alors, laquelle commence? De Pamela, Janet, Sharon? Pamela, the floor is yours.
Canada has been found guilty of historic and ongoing genocide, a genocide that was based on racism and sexism. That's a matter of fact. And that's a matter of law. The other part of the national inquiry said very specifically that we're not talking about a few isolated incidents here. We're talking about a complex set of laws, policies, practices, governing systems, economies, and societal values that are racist and sexist against Indigenous peoples and treat Indigenous women especially as exploitable and expendable and less worthy of life. Canada, its federal government, all of its provincial governments, all of its municipal governments, all of its societal institutions, policing, education, and especially healthcare, are all equally implicated in this, and so are many segments of society. So when we're talking about racism, oh yeah, there's lots of individual racism and beliefs, but it is so systemic. This entire country was created on racism. For anyone, to any politician, to even suggest that systemic racism doesn't exist would have to literally ignore the National Inquiry, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, every report that's ever come out of the United Nations, every justice inquiry, the Manitoba Justice Inquiry, the Saskatchewan Justice Inquiry, the Nova Scotia Justice Inquiry, which has all found that Canada and its institutions are guilty of racism systemic-wide in their laws, policies, practices, and omissions. They didn't just create genocide in one category, they're guilty of it in every category. And here's the kicker about genocide. You can't be guilty about genocide unless you have the intention to commit genocide. And the National Inquiry found that Canada has demonstrated a manifest pattern of an intention to destroy Indigenous peoples by targeting Native women and girls for exploitation, abuse, and dispossession. And that's exactly what they've done. And in their neglect to protect the human rights of Indigenous women and girls, that's what every institution and every government continues to do. So don't ever let any government official tell you otherwise.
Thank you, Pamela. Janet? You want to add something?
Miigwech. just in closing, I totally agree and support with what Pamela has just said. As we can see it ongoing right now, right across Canada, with all our young people who are being killed, and a jury will say, no, you know, it wasn't manslaughter or murder, and that's out in Alberta. But it's there, and we see all kinds of cases like this, so it is ongoing. But I guess what I would like to close off is by saying, as Anishinaabe people, a Anishinaabe nation, if we look back at our teachings and our roles within our communities, our women and our men, we had that balance, that mutual respect. And I think I saw a question there. It says, what role did our women have? Well, for many years, our women were the ones who kept that home fire together, because our men had to go out and earn a living because there wasn't any employment. But it was always that mutual respect and that understanding. And that is still happening today. It should be more so, but we are gradually beginning to recognize that. All the cultural revitalization has been done by our women in our community. Our women are the first teachers of the language. And so these are very important roles. And what our women's organizations, Indigenous women's organizations are doing is so important. And we have to keep on being supportive of each other, recognizing what our roles are within our communities. And I believe that our nations are matriarchal. I think that we're misinterpreted by the anthropologists, simply because if we went out on a trap line, the women followed and supposedly one step behind. I don't believe that, but that's what anthropologists say. So to all the women in Quebec, miigwech, for listening, and keep strong and be safe. Miigwech.
Thank you, Mrs. Lavelle-Corbière. Mrs. McCarver, this is the final word is for you.
And thank you. I want to thank you again for inviting me, and it's really great to see your faces. We don't get together much anymore, and so even seeing you virtually is almost as good as being there in the same room. So I'm really happy that you invited me. I wanted to just follow along on Pam's theme, that my teaching, I teach racism in Canada, and I rushed away from my class that I was teaching about racism in Canada to join the panel today. And all of the structure that are in place, we've got our public education system. It is ongoing colonization. It's based on keeping the European system in place. And if you get into there are several of us that have multiple, university degrees, and there's nothing in the teaching in the law schools that I went to or others that is not colonial based. And it is the one that keeps the racism in place. I just taught about how racism affects kids in school and how it operates. And so, we're thinking, okay, well, it's not really racist. Almost everything has a racial part to it. I know personally going into the courtroom, racism, for me as an Indigenous woman in the courtroom, doing my job as a lawyer in the courtroom. So, there's total denial out there by a lot of people, including many of members, Indigenous people, that it's not really racist. It's rampant racism. And if you look at how it forms itself with the teaching of what they call Eurocentric, the European way of life is the ideal way of life. And it's what's taught when the minute you go into a public school, the minute those kids go to nursery school, they start learning about the European culture and the language and all of that. And unless they're really lucky, we've got some places in the country where we do have the Indigenous language immersion schools, but they're not very, there's not very many of them, and they're not well supported financially. So that's what I want to say, that what the whole system is built on was the dispossession of the land. Every rule that was in place was about taking the land and resources. And what we have is a totally Eurocentric system, and it's still on dispossessing us of the land. I'm sitting on in Laketmak territory that is totally unceded, not even a whisper of a treaty in this area, but we don't have very much of it. And everything that we encounter, the Indian Act, by taking the women out of the community, because she was the one that taught the language and the culture, and putting the white women in the community who had nothing, their only teaching was the Eurocentric way, was a big step in dismantling our communities. So I think we've got to look at the bigger picture here. And the bigger picture isn't any different, very little different now than it was 153 years ago. And so racism is out there, alive and well. And for Indigenous women, especially Indigenous women who are obviously Indigenous women, meaning that we look like Indigenous women, that's still not a very friendly place out there for us. And so the Indian Act itself was found to be discriminatory, and that discrimination was the key that put the Indigenous women, the murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls in the position they were in. And so we got to remember that nothing the government does is gratuitous. Yeah. We, like Jeanette, we've been fighting for 50 years to get out from being a second-class citizen, and we're not there yet. Mm-hmm. And we've got a long ways to go. And I'll be doing this for quite a while, and as most of us have been. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much, Miigwech Pamela. I know that you have another engagement starting at 8. So thank you for the four of us with Viviane. It was very inspiring. It's 8 o'clock, so I won't be long. Thank you all participants, and thank you to Leah, Anna, and Colette who organized the event tonight. It was a great moment. Thank you very much, Miigwech.
Moi, j'aurais juste rajouté à la fin un gros merci. Gros merci à ces guerrières, vraiment, d'être disponibles ce soir. Vous savez, ce mouvement où est-ce que Femmes autochtones participent avec Jeannette Lavette-Corbière, Sharon McCarver, Pamela. On a d'autres aussi, d'autres femmes qui s'est jointes à cette lutte. On s'est engagé à éduquer les nôtres, à informer les nôtres sur les impacts de la loi S3. Plus on va donner l'information, mieux c'est, faire connaître tous les impacts. Et on a même offert notre collaboration au ministre Miller qui, je pense, on leur fait peur. On leur fait peur parce qu'on apporte les bons arguments, les vrais arguments qui devraient être changés et apporter un changement, évidemment. Et notre résilience, a formé en nous, les femmes, la persévérance. On ne lâchera pas, comme Sharon est en train de nous dire. Merci.
Merci, thank you. Bonne soirée. Miigwech.